Hey folks, artfully vain Darren with Fervent Astronomy here, talking to you about one of my toys, my little vanity items, the Sigma 35mm f2 DGDN Contemporary I-Series lens, in this case for Sony E-mount, but also available in L-mount. And this is one of Sigma's nice all-metal primes that they released in the last few years. Maybe a little bit slower than your average prime, but a little bit more compact and more of an experience lens, and that's really why I like it. Here, of course, just like its siblings, it's got nice metal construction, a really nice dampened manual focus ring, a clicky aperture ring. I just can't get enough of that. It does have an A setting here if you prefer to control aperture via the camera, or if you're cool like me, you use it in full manual aperture all the time with manual focus and all of the manual shutter speed and ISO values and everything like that. And you pretend like it's the 70s and your camera is actually an old-time filming camera. And I don't know when I can get an out from this bit because I didn't really think it through, so I'm just going to stop out of nowhere. At any rate, this does not have a lock switch for that aperture ring, so you are liable to accidentally sort of put it in or out depending on how you're using it. So keep in mind on that, but there's like a little detente there that kind of tries to hold it in place. Overall, you've got a manual focus autofocus switch on the side, and that's kind of it. On the back here, we technically, there's like technically a rubber gasket, but if it's like 1 micron above the edge of the bayonet here, it's like 1,000. Like, that is the tiniest thing I've ever seen. But what are you gonna do? All metal hood. Oh, love it. And here beneath the 58mm filter thread, see we have our wonderful compact little front element there. We also have the magnetic caps for these as well, and those are really cool. I love those. Magnets are so cool. Like, they're just so cool. So the big question is, will this lens be good for astrophotography? Well, I can't imagine that it would be, but we're gonna find out together. So let's pop into Lightroom and pull the wool off our eyes together. Hey folks, welcome to Lightroom, where we're of course looking at the Sigma 35mm f2 DGDN Contemporary I-Series, and I'm making air quotes, lens, released in 2020. Great year, that one. And this is for Sony E-mount, but also I'm sure L-mount, and if any of y'all are lucky, perhaps Canon or Nikon one of these days. But actually, it is worth mentioning, you can, if I didn't do a bit about it in the talking head portion, you can adapt this lens to Nikon Z-mount using something like a Megadap ETZ21 adapter, full autofocus, all that good stuff. I do that personally with my ZF. It works a treat, and this lens looks real nice on that ZF, just saying. All right, that aside, here I wasn't using a ZF, I was using a Sony a7R Mark V, 60 megapixel monster. Absolutely cruel to put lenses through this. It lets nothing hide, and these are 60-second exposures, tracked exposures, taken with the Fornax Mounts LighTrack II. Fervent Astronomy happens to be Fornax Mounts North American distributor. So if you're interested in learning more about that, head over to ferventastronomy.com. All of these samples are taken at ISO 320 pretty much. ISO 320 is the A7R Mark V's second base ISO. If you don't know what I'm talking about ISO invariance. If you look over to the top corner of the screen, sometime around now, there should be a link popping up to a video I've done on the subject. If you prefer reading, in the description is a link. It'll bring you back to the website where I've got a in-depth article linked, written by some people who are very, very smart, and it's a very, very good read if that's your preference. While you're there, you can find these samples for download, and you can get them in full RAW, pixel peep, do all that good stuff, decide if this is the lens for you. As always though, this does represent my hard work. I do own the copyright to these images, so please respect that. Please don't use them for other purposes, just assessing whether you want to buy this lens or not. All right, so I don't have any untracked samples for this one, so let's just dive right in. And right away we see that it's a little bit dark here. This is at f2, even though it is a 60-second exposure. So I'm just going to brighten them up. So now we can see a little bit of what's going on. And right away we see there is vignetting. If you look in the navigator, it can be easier to see. A lot of vignetting, and that is pretty normal, especially for a lens like this. that doesn't have a huge front element, they tend to have a little bit more vignetting. We can also see that there are some definite purple fringing with this lens. Zooming into the center here, yeah, very purple, very fringe, much fringe, and this is chromatic aberration. Essentially, the lens is not able to focus the blue and some red wavelengths into the tight center where it's white, and they get sort of bloated out here and out of focus. And that shows up as a fringe. To us, if we got rid of the rest of the light, it would just be an out of focus blue ball. But that is not uncommon, and there are some corrections that can at least correct the color. Here we're at f2. If we cycle down to 2.2, we can see that there is a darkening in the center of the lens. And if you watch the histogram, you can see what's happening. The histogram's shifting to the left a little bit, at least on the right-hand side. If the left-hand side stays where it is, that means we're not losing any illumination in the darker parts of the frame. The left-hand side is the dark parts of the histogram, the right-hand side is the lighter parts. So this left half of the graph here, if it stays relatively stable, stopping down won't damage any of that illumination, so we're not losing exposure there. In this case, I don't really think that we are going down to 2.2. We go to 2.5, we are starting to touch the left side of the histogram, so we are potentially losing a little bit. It's maybe not worth stopping down too much, at least just for the consistent contrast. Here we can see things do look a little bit fuzzy, a little bit hazy. If we stop down here to 2.2, you can see that we do get a little bit better contrast, and we're not losing much of the exposure on the stars. So that could be something to consider. While we're here, we may as well go through the rest of the range. So this is 2.2, 2.5, and 2.8. Back to f2 here. So yeah, I'm not sure it'd be worth it personally, but you're your own person. Next, let's look at the corners. And here right away, we can see that we have some astigmatism. This is not coma, this is astigmatism. It's actually two types of astigmatism. The body of these little space birds is tangential astigmatism, and the wings going the other way at a 90-degree angle, that is sagittal astigmatism. If you can imagine, there are infinite radii coming from the center to the edges of the frame, and everywhere that a star lands along one of those, it is going to stretch out towards the center of the frame, or at least along that radius. And if there's sagittal astigmatism, you'll get various shapes, but they'll come out at roughly a 90-degree angle to that initial tangential astigmatism. What is all this? Well, the lens is having trouble focusing these pinpoints into a pinpoint. So they're stretching out in this direction and stretching out in this direction. And if we look around the frame, you can see that in the upper right, shape changes a little bit. Bottom right, subtle change. Bottom left, subtle change again. The shapes aren't all completely the same. And that's just indicating a little bit of a lack of symmetry. This isn't the highest end lens on the planet, so I wouldn't expect them to be perfectly symmetrical, especially not with having this much astigmatism. Now, I know some of you are, what's this astigmatism stuff? I thought that's coma. Well, no, coma is something else. And as we come in here from the edge to the center of the frame, I'll see if I can find any. And while we do have this bloating due to the chromatic aberration, I don't really see any coma. So what is coma? Coma is named after coma from comets. The technical name is actually chromatic aberration. So if you can imagine, we've got, of course, our star here, and it's relatively well defined, but if one side starts to get fuzzed out, either pointing towards the center of the frame or towards the edge of the frame, then you've got coma. And it's, of course, slightly evocative of comets. That's why they call it coma or chromatic aberration. So we'll get on the bright stars, we'll get all these little fuzzy tails that'll either point towards the center in the case of internal coma, or the edges in the case of external coma. In this case, I'm not really seeing coma or chromatic aberration. We've got the fringing, we've got, of course, this astigmatism, but no actual coma. We do not have spherical distortion, I don't believe. This bloating is mostly due to the inability of the lens to focus that blue, but I'm not seeing general bloating on other colored stars as well. So I think we're good in that regard. And when it comes to field curvature, let's see what we've got. It's a little bit tough maybe to assess because the shapes are changing due to that astigmatism, but I don't really think we're suffering much in the way of field curvature. It's not a very fast lens, so I'm not super surprised. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, lenses, as you probably noticed, are made of curved glass, and they need to focus light onto a flat sensor. Curved and flat are different things, so what you might actually experience is that, let's say you're in focus in the center, as you get towards the edge, things might fall out of focus. And that's what we would call field curvature. Basically, the field of focus is literally curving, and you would be able to focus for stars in the corners, and the center wouldn't be in focus, just like if you're in focus in the center, the corners are out of focus in some cases. But in this case, I don't really think it's an issue, and I need to correct myself. I did do an untracked shot here. This is with the A7R Mark V. It's a 15-second exposure at f2. This will give you an example of the star trails. And here you can see these star trails are about 2, maybe 3 star diameters. So they are starting to become noticeable. It is quite dark. It is quite crunchy here. In the case of this camera, cranking the ISO wouldn't really do you any good. If you've watched that ISO invariance video, you'll know why. And here, I don't know that you could go too much longer and not start to notice them. This is a 60 megapixel camera though, so a 24 megapixel camera, you can get away with longer shots because these star trails will actually trail over fewer pixels and they'll be less noticeable. So that's something to keep in mind. This blank sample here, see how it's blank? That's good because this is taken with my modified A7R Mark IV, and there is no infrared light pollution coming from the inside of this lens, which is not true of its sibling, the 65mm f2. The 65mm Sigma I-series lens, unfortunately for some reason, has an IR optocoupler or some other infrared light source in the lens, and it will show up in any shots taken with a modified camera. So that lens, it's kind of sad. This lens, you're A-okay. One thing I didn't do with this lens, unfortunately, is a shot to test aperture vignetting, and just given the astigmatism, I'm not sure that it would be a huge deal, but essentially, aperture vignetting is when the physical body of the lens itself actually blocks some of the light that's coming into the lens, and the further you get to the edges, very bright pinpoints, stars, planets, that type of thing, will really start to freak out and form this almost butterfly shape. And in this case, I just don't have the information, so I apologize for that. That's a new metric I was starting to test actually shortly after taking these photos. But that's okay. Let's pop into the develop module. We will remove chromatic aberration. Of course, that is not doing anything in this case. So we can come into the manual tab here, grab our defringe dropper, click on that purple blue, and you'll notice that it corrects. There is some pink here. Can try correcting that as well, but that brings the purple back, and you can see that we're jumping back and forth. You might be able to get away with doing it manually. The more you muck with the defringe dropper, the more you risk actually causing some issues here. And even with max amount, I'm not seeing any checkerboard. So I think it'd be mostly okay in this case. So that's nice. That does make things, when viewed at a normal distance, less crunchy. Let's come over here and enable profile corrections, and right away, almost all of the vignetting is corrected, which is great. Loving that. And we can see that there is some barrel distortion that's being corrected for. The lens, essentially, you can imagine the center of the frame is sort of bulged out towards the viewer and the edges and corners are pushed away. So if we enable profile corrections here, it'll flatten the center of the frame and it'll stretch the edges and corners out a little bit to bring everything into the same general plane. If there were any straight lines, it's the only straight lines up there in the sky right now are the silly satellite trails, but if there were any straight lines, their geometries would be repaired by doing this. If we just scale down slightly, you can see what's happening here. The corners are getting stretched out, actually quite a bit. So you're losing some of your field of view, some of the stuff in the extreme corners, but not a lot on the edges there, at least in the center. So I don't think you're really losing too much in the way of composition. Yeah, you might be losing a little bit in the corners, but given the performance of the corners, I would hope you would keep anything important towards the center of the frame. Anyway, actually we can see Andromeda down here. You can see it's just about at the spot that doesn't shift. So there's sort of like a safe zone around that as well. Just avoid putting stuff in the extreme corners and you should be fine. All right, so I hope you found that useful. If you're planning to use this lens, if you're planning to buy this lens, just found it entertaining. If you wouldn't mind hitting the thumbs up button. I know I hate the YouTube stuff, but that and leaving comments and doing all those YouTube things really helps get these videos seen by a wider audience. It tells YouTube to show it to more people, and it helps them actually show up in search results, because a lot of times the videos don't even show up in search results. So if you would do that, I would be much obliged. And I especially love hearing from people in the comments. I love chatting. So if you have any questions, please, it's a joy to interact with people in that way. So with that, let's wrap it up outside of Lightroom. Well, no surprises here really, but that's okay. I still love you 35 f2, and this is making like 10 of you really annoyed. This isn't what it's for, right? And that being said, you can still use it. It's usable. It's fine. It's fine. It's okay. Is it the best choice? No. But like I always say, make sure that you put your socks on when you wake up in the morning to keep your feet warm. Should this be like the astrophotography lens of the year? No, of course not. If you have it and it's what you got, use it. That's really what it comes down to. If you like this lens and you have it and you don't have another 35 and you want to give 35 a shot, you want to do some 35 Milky Way or something, and you're like, oh, all I have is this lens. Oh, should I do Milky Way photography with this lens? Yes, do it. Just do it. Like, never go, oh, I'm going to stay inside and not go experience the cosmos because I don't have the right lens. Use whatever you got, okay? If this is what you got, use it, love it. I love it. I'm Darren. This is Fervent Astronomy. I'm going to cut it off here. I hope you had fun, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one.